jets in an open sky, a streak of gray, and a cheerful... A loop, a whirl, and a vertical climb, and once again, you'll know it's time for the adventures of...
Would you believe Chapter 3 of Freddy the Politician? Yes, River and Libby, we are back once again to continue the exciting story of Freddy the Politician, Chapter 3. So here we have the first page of Chapter 3. We see a picture of two, maybe woodchucks or muskrats, something like that, lifting a sign that says First Animal Bank of Centerboro. You may recall that at the end of Chapter 2, Jinx and the woodpecker had gone to see Freddy the pig to discuss opening an animal bank. Looks like they're going to do it. Let's find out. The next 2 weeks were very busy ones on the bean farm. The idea of electing a president was enthusiastically received. It would be a great thing, the animals all felt, to found the first animal republic. Of course, none of them knew very much about how to start a republic or how to hold an election, but Freddy read up about it in his encyclopedia, and John Quincy was a great help too, for of course, living in Washington, the woodpecker knew all about government. Freddy and Jinx and some of the others were all for holding the election right away, but when John Quincy heard of this, he said he thought they ought to wait until they had got the bank started. "Oh, you just say that because you're to be the president of the bank," said Freddy. "Dear me," said John Quincy, "I am in no hurry for that, I assure you. No, it merely occurs to me that your main reason for starting a republic is so that the farm will be well run in Mr. Bean's absence. But Mr. Bean isn't planning to go abroad for another month, so I'm told, and in the meantime, if you don't convince him that you are capable of taking on such a responsible job, he may not go at all. The quickest way to convince him is to start your bank." "Well, why can't we do both right away?" asked Jinx. "Because it will take longer to get the bank going," said the woodpecker. "Anybody can start a republic in 5 minutes, but a bank, well, you haven't even got any safe deposit vaults yet." "Safe deposit vaults?" said Freddy. "Sure," said John Quincy. "That's what a bank has to have. Burglar-proof vaults. Underground with steel doors and somebody to guard them for money and valuables." Now that brings up an interesting point. What is a safe deposit vault? Well, here's a picture of a real safe deposit vault in a real bank. On one side you can see the gigantic, thick, round door that's filled with locks. If you walk straight ahead through the door we're looking at, inside the room you can see there are many drawers and cabinets. Each one of these also has locks. These are where people keep their valuable jewelry or money. And in the night when no one's around, they shut the big door and lock it down tight so that no burglars can get in to steal the money and valuables. Of course, the animals won't be able to make a vault as fancy as this, but let's hear what they do decide to do. They were going to have the bank in an old tool shed that stood by the side of the road some distance from the house. So Jinx hired a family of woodchucks that lived in the upper pasture to come down and dig some vaults under the shed. They dug a tunnel about 25 feet long, big enough for Jinx to crawl through, and at the end they dug 2 rooms, a smaller room for money and a larger room for valuables. They put a board over the opening of the tunnel, and whoever was on guard sat on it. The day the bank opened for business, Freddy brought out the sign he had painted, and they hung it up. It read, First Animal Bank of Centerboro. President, John Quincy Adams. Treasurer, Jinx. Secretary, Freddy. Capital, none yet. Resources, unlimited. These names are the guarantee of your security. Why worry about the safety of your money and valuables? Bring them to us, and let us do the worrying. Do business with the old, reliable firm. For the first few days, the bank was crowded from dawn to dusk. Animals came from miles around to open accounts or to leave valuables in safekeeping. Most of them came out of curiosity to see how a bank worked or to have a talk with its distinguished president, but of course they all brought something. There was a line at the door that extended away off down the road, and as each one came in, John Quincy would talk with him for a minute, explaining how the bank worked, and then Freddy would write down in a notebook what they had brought, and one of the squirrels, whom they had engaged as cashiers and clerks, would take it down into the vaults. By the end of the third day, there was $21.03 in the money room, and the valuables room was so full that there wasn't any space for anything more. "It's a good thing the entrance to the vaults is so small," said Jinx. "Suppose we had to take in things like that ox yoke that cow from Lakeville wanted us to keep for her because her great-granduncle used to wear it." And we have to draw the line at foodstuffs, too," said John Quincy. "I turned away several dogs that came in with bones, and squirrels have been bringing in thousands of nuts. What kind of a bank is it to be president of? One that has its vaults full of nuts?" "Well, for that matter," said Freddy, "what kind of a bank is it that doesn't charge for its services? I vote we charge a cent a month on all accounts." As soon as this monthly charge was announced, business fell off badly. But although most animals haven't much use for money, they can always get a little if they need it. In a district that has been settled for 150 years, many thousands of coins have been lost. They have slipped from purses, dropped through holes in pockets, fallen through cracks and down mouse holes. They are sprinkled all over the countryside, and it is the little animals, and particularly the birds, who know where they are. And so, if a squirrel knew where there was a nickel, it was worth his trouble to bring it along with his winter supply of nuts to the bank. For 5 months his hoard would be safe from the robbers against whom he must always be on watch. But there were many other things besides nuts brought in for safekeeping. Oddly enough, the 3 wealthiest depositors in the bank were Ferdinand the Crow and Alice and Emma, the 2 ducks. Ferdinand, like all crows, was a great collector. In his nest in the dead pine tree over in the woods, he was popularly supposed to have hidden a treasure worth a king's ransom. Indeed, there were some valuable things in his collection. 6 gold coins, a brooch set with diamonds in the form of a rabbit, a number of unmounted emeralds and sapphires, and so on. But Ferdinand collected things that were bright and glittered, regardless of their value, and so mixed in with these things, which men too like to hoard, there were bits of glass and shiny bottle caps and pins and pieces of tin and a brass thimble. All these things Ferdinand brought into the bank for safekeeping, for lately he had noticed a number of blue jays hanging around the pine tree, and blue jays are great thieves. Alice and Emma didn't care much about collecting, although in exploring the mud at the bottom of ponds and creeks they often picked up things that had been dropped out of boats. But they had inherited their Uncle Wesley's collection, and that was a very fine collection indeed, for Uncle Wesley had traveled a great deal and had stirred up the mud at the bottom of many much-traveled lakes and streams, and had found and brought home more jewelry than you could shake a stick at. Alice and Emma kept the collection at the bottom of Mr. Bean's duck pond, but they were nervous, fluttery little ducks, and were always worrying about it. Emma, didn't care for jewelry and never wore any, but Alice occasionally put on a string of pearls when she went calling. She would have liked to wear some of the diamonds, but Emma did not think diamonds were refined. The Ducks were very much relieved when they had entrusted all this wealth to the bank. One day, when the bank had been open about a week, Mr. Bean harnessed Hank, the old white horse, to the buggy and started into town. But when he came opposite the shed, with the big sign in front, he pulled on the reins. "Whoa, Hank!" he shouted. "What in tarnation's this?" Hank looked around but didn't say anything. Mr. Bean knew that his animals could talk, but he was a pretty conventional man. That means he didn't like new things very much. He liked to have everything go on just as it had when he was a boy. That was the reason he still drove a buggy instead of a car, and so it made him feel uncomfortable and a little embarrassed when he heard animals talk. He just couldn't get used to it. It was a little confusing for the animals sometimes. Mr. Bean thought them impolite if they didn't answer, and on the other hand, it upset him if they did. But in this case, Hank decided that no answer was necessary. If Mr. Bean wanted to know what the bank was, he had only to read the sign, which he did. First Animal Bank, eh? So that's what they've started. Good sound idea. Teach 'em the value of money. President John Quincy Adams. Hey, you can't have this. You animals will be getting me into trouble with the government using that name. Tut, tut. We'll have to see about this. And he dropped the reins on the dashboard and climbed out. He walked into the shed and up to the counter that the two boys, Byram and Adoniram, had built for the bankers. A horse with a straw hat on, who had come in to inquire if the bank would lend him money to buy a new pair of shoes, moved aside respectfully, and John Quincy, who had been talking to the horse, hopped forward. "Good morning, sir. What can we do for you?" Mr. Bean gave a slight shudder, as he always did when he heard an animal speak. "Who are you?" he said. "Stranger here, ain't you?" "Not any longer, I hope, sir," said the woodpecker. "Let us say, rather, a new arrival in your delightful community." "This is John Quincy, Mr. Bean," said Jinks, "the president of our new bank." Mr. Bean gave a grunt. Then he said, "Well, if his name's John Quincy, his name's John Quincy. But if he's president of the bank, he's president of the bank. But you got to take that name Adams off your sign." "But that's his name," protested Jinks. "He was named after the president." "I was named after my grandfather," said Mr. Bean, "but I don't go around pretending I'm him." "Neither do I," said the woodpecker indignantly. "Go around pretending you're my grandfather?" said Mr. Bean. "I should hope not." "Go around pretending I'm the president," said John Quincy. "Oh," said Mr. Bean. "Well, maybe you don't, but it looks like it. And whether you are or not, folks are going to criticize me for letting you do it. So fix up that sign." He turned to go, but the horse with the straw hat said nervously, Don't you approve of this bank, Mr. Bean? Don't you think it's a good bank?" "Approve of it? Well, certainly I approve of it. It's the first animal bank in the country, isn't it? It's run by my animals, ain't it? That is all but this John Quincy here, and I expect he's all right. Who says it ain't a good bank?" "Why, nobody," said the horse. "Well then," said Mr. Bean. He looked sharply at the horse. "I've seen you somewhere before," he said. "I'm Zenas Witherspoon's Jerry," said the horse. "I just come over to see if I could borrow enough to buy some new shoes." "Oh, sure, thought I recognized that long nose," said Mr. Bean. "Why don't Zenas buy shoes for you?" "Well, he hasn't got any money. He had a bad year last year." "Well," said Mr. Bean, "he hadn't ought to have bought you that hat. In my day, horses didn't wear hats. They weren't afraid of a little sun." "It's Mrs. Witherspoon's hat," said Jerry. "She don't ever go out, so she gave it to me." "'Twasn't much of a present," said Mr. Bean dryly. Then he said to John Quincy, "Well, President, what are you going to do about this loan? I want to see how your bank works." "Well, we can't lend you our depositors' money unless you give us good security," said John Quincy. "I guess we'll have to refuse the loan." "Security?" said Jerry. "What's that?" "Well, it's anything of value that you'd leave with us. Then, if you couldn't pay back the money when you'd promised to, we'd sell the thing and get our money." "Or maybe you could get somebody to go on your note," suggested Freddy. "Gosh," said the horse perplexedly, "you certainly have a lot of ways of saying you won't lend me the money." "He just means that you might get somebody to promise to pay the money back if you can't yourself," said Jinx. The horse dropped his head. "Well, there ain't anybody," he said sadly. "I guess I'll just have to try to do the spring plowing in my bare hoofs." And he turned to go. "I'll go on your note," said Mr. Bean suddenly. "Give him the money, Jinx. I'll sign the paper. I suppose I'll lose out on it, and old Zenas will laugh his head off my buying shoes for his horse. But I can't see an animal put out that way, even somebody else's animal." So they gave Jerry $6, and he thanked Mr. Bean and galloped off to the blacksmith shop. Mrs. Witherspoon's hat cocked gaily over his right ear. "What's more," said Mr. Bean, "I guess I'd better make a little deposit in the first animal myself." And he drew out a roll of bills and peeled off $100 and opened an account with it. Then he went out and got in the buggy, picked up the reins, and said, "Get up." When Mr. Bean got to town, he went first into the First National Bank of Centerboro, which was an imposing white marble structure on the corner of Main and Liberty Streets. He went into the handsome office of the president, Mr. Henry Weiser, and sat down. "Well, Henry," he said, "you've got some competition out our way." Mr. Weiser was a small, neat man with white hair, starched cuffs, and gold-rimmed nose-glasses that fell off whenever you mentioned a sum of money larger than $10. "Yes, sir," said Mr. Bean. "Don't my animals beat all? They've opened a bank." "Oh, dear me," said Mr. Weiser in a dry voice. He didn't smile, but Mr. Bean didn't mind, because Mr. Weiser never smiled unless you paid him something. He was not an unkind man, though, just terribly interested in banking. "Yes, sir," said Mr. Bean, "a regular bank. And they've got safe deposit vaults that no burglar could ever get into." "You don't tell me," said Mr. Weiser. "I do tell you," said Mr. Bean, "and furthermore I tell you that they're the smartest animals in the country. I was kind of hesitating about taking that trip abroad together with Mrs. Bean and the boys. Mrs. Bean has had her heart set on it, but my land, animals that can run a regular bank can certainly look after a farm for half a year." "I should think they could," admitted Mr. Weiser. "Well, I'll try to bear up under the competition. I expect they won't cut into our business a great deal." "Oh, don't you be too sure," said Mr. Bean. "They've got deposits now of $179.42. Mr. Weiser's glasses fell off, but he put them on again hurriedly and looked sharply at Mr. Bean. "What!" he exclaimed. "Animals have put that much money into a bank?" "Animals and folks. They've got at least one man as depositor I know." "Oh, but look here," said Mr. Weiser excitedly. They can't do that, Mr. Bean. This is a real bank you're talking about. There isn't room for two banks in Centerboro. Oh, dear me, I must ask you to stop it at once." "Now, hold your horses, Henry," said Mr. Bean. "If my animals want to start a bank, they can start a bank. They got as good a right as you have." "Oh, they have no right to cut into our business here," said Mr. Weiser angrily. "I won't have it. I'll take it up with the authorities." Mr. Bean got up. "Stuff and nonsense," he said. "I thought you'd like the idea, Henry. Smart animals. Credit to the town." But Mr. Weiser didn't feel that way about it at all. He said again that he was going to complain to the authorities, and he picked up the telephone and called the authorities up. But Mr. Bean got mad, and he walked out of the cashier's window and drew out all his money, which amounted to $4,845.92, and he drove back and deposited it all in the first animal. So, at the end of that day, the deposits of the First Animal Bank of Centerboro came to a grand total of $5,025.44, as you can figure out for yourself. Only you won't come out right unless you remember that while Mr. Bean was in town, a rabbit had brought in a dime to deposit. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 3 of Freddy the Politician. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you both have beautiful dreams, and I'll see you next time when we continue reading Freddy the Politician, Chapter 4.